it's Nicole. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we're going to transition 3 orchids into self-watering semi-hydroponic setup. The first one we're going to transition is the Brassavola Yellow Bird that I have here from Hauserman Orchids. It's potted up in bark, and we're going to transition it over into Leca self-watering. This next orchid is the Brassavola Digbyana. It's in the same setup with bark. This one's a seedling. It has a couple of new roots, so we're going to transition this one over as well. And it is in a pretty small pot, so it's in need of a larger container. The last orchid that we're going to transition over is the Neophanetia falcata. And this one is in a bark and a sphagnum moss setup. This one has a lot of roots, so this one I will be watching very carefully. But we're going to transition all 3 into a self-watering pot. So I typically use a decorative pot in the bottom with a clear pot, preferably, with a wick that will wick the water up. So it's a very airy setup, and we're going to test this out and see how all these orchids do. So let's get started. So kicking things off, I'm going to start by rinsing and boiling all of my leca. And I rinse it out a couple of times before I go ahead and boil it because it has a lot of sediment in it. So I've rinsed this a couple of times. As you can see, it still has a little bit of that brown residue, but we boil it to make sure it's all clean. Now, after it's been boiled for about 20 minutes, I give it a rinse. And it just makes sure that I get all of that sediment out. It can be a little tricky to get off, but I make sure it's very clean. Once my leca is nice and clean, I like to add some kelp. I use the Bloom City brand clean kelp, and then I add it straight to my leca mix. And the goal here is that kelp is good for the roots and it promotes root growth. So I want to get my orchids started off on the right foot. So I add some directly to my leca and water mixture. And it's best that you soak this for at least 24 hours and let those leca beads absorb it. So I'm mixing it in here in a little bit of water. Again, it's best that you leave it for a couple of hours or even overnight so that it could soak in thoroughly. But this is the next step I take after cleaning my leca. So I'm going to get started with the Brassavola Digbyana. So this orchid is in bark. It is about 2 to 3 years from blooming, and it came in this little 2-inch pot. So I'm going to take off the bark. I'm going to be very careful with the roots. And I'm going to gently start removing the bark. I did soak this pot for a little while because it does have some new root growth on the top, and some of the roots have grown into the bark. So I'll just need to be very careful with that. So I'll fast forward through here as I get all the bark off. There are a couple of pieces that were stuck to the top of the roots. So what I did was I took a bowl of water and I let it soak there for a little while longer so I don't damage those tender new root growths. So I'm just going to let it sit there for a little while and it should loosen up and come off very easily. So at this point, I noticed a lot of them look like they have new bark on the root tips. So I decided to start removing the media from the other 2 orchids just to keep everything moving. So the next one I am going to work on is the Neophanetia falcata. And when I'm just going to empty the pot out, inspect the root system, and make sure that I'm freeing the medium off of the roots. And in this case, this Neophanetia has a very extensive root system, very healthy. I'm just being very careful as I take it out of the pot to make sure I don't break any roots. And in this case, this orchid is in bark. It's not nearly as attached as the Brassavola Digbyana, so the pieces are coming out a little bit easier. And a lot of it is to do when roots grow into the bark when they're new, they tend to attach themselves. So just like they do in the wild, they tend to attach themselves on trees. When they grow into bark, they tend to attach themselves really tightly into the bark. So I'm just being very careful as I remove the pieces. In this case, it's not too bad. I am noticing that it does have a great root system. I noticed in the middle, you could see that some of those roots are a little bit darker. So I noticed that it may have had a plug there. It looks like I'm going to have to trim some roots because it is just a different color. Looks like the plug may still be there. So I want to make sure I get rid of all of that before putting it into Leca. So I really like this orchid because it has a lot of new growth. So here's one, here's two, three. Looks like it has 4 fans. So yeah, it's got 4 fans and it is a healthy orchid. It had just bloomed for me after I got it. So I did want to repot it since it had just finished blooming and just give it a new start. So I'm going to put it into self-watering semi-hydro. And just like the Brassavola digbyana, I'm going to put it in some water to make sure that the rest of the bark that was left can be taken out very easily. So I'm just letting it soak there as I work on the Brassolalia yellowbird. So this one I knew was going to be challenging because this orchid has quite a lot of new roots on top that look like they attach themselves quite tightly to the bark. So as you can see it right now, you can see that the bottom looks like it'll be no problem to take off, but the top part of those roots, as they grew into that brand new bark, they'd adhered themselves quite tightly. So I'm trying to be very careful. It's still quite a young orchid. It's 1 year from blooming, this one, and I just have to be really, really careful. So I'm treading very lightly. I don't want to break any root tips as I'm taking all these bark pieces off. This is one of the most challenging parts when you're repotting. I find that it's taking bark off for roots that have just grown into the bark. And the other part that's difficult is taking roots out of a pot that has holes in it it's grown through the holes. So it's always really, really tough, really difficult to make sure that you're not injuring those roots. So I'm going to tread very lightly here as I'm taking these bark pieces off. I already know that I need to do another soaking to make sure that these roots are going to be okay. So I'm going to fast forward and show you the next step. So this was a tough one. I definitely need to soak this one. So I'm going to leave it as I work on the rest of the other orchids in taking off the little pieces of bark. And I just took off the medium off all of them for the sake of time, but I am going to spray them down with hydrogen peroxide in between, just in case there's any pests that live in the roots or in the medium. There are times where you may not see anything, but it could be that there's snail eggs or something like that. So I'm potting them up right now. I'm taking them all out. I'm holding one and the other, but I'm going to end up sanitizing and making sure that we're killing off any pests with hydrogen peroxide. So back to the Brassavola digbyana, I am removing the small pieces of bark that were stuck. Now that it's been soaking for a little while, it's a tiny bit easier. Then I'm going to cut off all of the dead roots. And while I was cutting the roots, I noticed that there was a little piece of a little keiki that came off of the orchid. At least I think it was. It was very small. So it looks like this is still a very young plant. I don't know if it was in the same flask. I mean, obviously it was in the same flask with others, so I think that was a little extra one. So as I'm taking all of the medium out, I'm noticing that there's quite a few new roots, and it also looks like there may have been two orchids in here, but it looks like the roots are tangled up because the rhizome is not attached. So I just noticed that, but again, because these roots are new, they've grown together. So it looks like there's two different plants within this. There's one larger plant, and then there's a smaller plant, and then there's the little baby plant that I just took off. It was too small. I don't think it'll survive on its own in the semi-hydroponic setup, so I just threw it on the side. But we're going to keep moving on. We're going to go to the other plants and start removing the little pieces of bark. You definitely need a lot of patience to do this, so sometimes it can feel quite therapeutic, especially after a long, crazy day at work. But if you're in a bad mood, I would save it. You do need your patience when you're removing the little pieces of bark. But this is a Neophanetia falcata. What I'm doing here is I'm going to trim off all of those dead roots. The root system is good looking. It looks great. Just the middle of the Neophanetia looks like those roots are done. You could see that they're quite dark. As I'm feeling them, they're squishy. They don't feel like they have firmness. They don't have substance. So I'm going to start trimming those off. So the Neophanetia is all done. I put it back to soak in water just to make sure I get everything else off. So now we're going back to the Brassolalia yellowbird, which is going to be the most challenging orchid just because it had so many brand new root tips that grew into the pieces of bark. I am going to sterilize my scissors, of course, because we're going from orchid to orchid. So I don't want to introduce any fungal infections or any problems from the last orchid to the next, just in case. So what I'm doing here is I'm gently releasing the little pieces of bark. And when you soak the orchid for some time, the bark tends to swell a little bit, and then it becomes much easier to remove. So I'm taking my time here because those tender roots, they need to be alive for the semi-hydro transition. So anything with a green root tip, as you can see a couple up top, anything with a green root tip is likely to survive the transition, and it'll keep growing into the Leca beads. Some of those older roots, sometimes they make it, but sometimes they don't make the transition to the new environment. So I'm just trying to be very careful, especially as I am removing it from those root tips. And as you can see, I'm sort of pinching the bark and making sure that I'm not ripping those root tips. It takes a lot of patience. As you can see, that root grew into a groove, so that's a hard one. But I'm being very, very patient. Sometimes it's inevitable to break some of these roots, but you just have to take your time with it. So I took the medium off as best as I could, and I cleared off most of the dead roots with the exception of the Digbyana. So that one, I want to make sure that it's anchored well into the pot since it has less roots. So I just kept more than I normally would. And then what I'm doing is I have my wick. I made it extra long so I could bring it all the way to the top, and that brings more moisture all the way up to the Leca. So usually Leca has a drier layer at the very top, so bringing the wick up helps get that moisture more evenly distributed. So I'm filling the Leca, and I'm starting to put a little bit of a layer at the bottom. And then I'm going to put my orchid in the middle of the pot, but I want to make sure that I maintain the wick up high. And I want to make sure that it's also enough to hit the bottom of that water reservoir. I don't want it to fall, so I'm keeping it up top, and that's just going to ensure for more even distribution of the moisture. And I'm taking my orchid, I am putting it at a level where it is pretty flush to the top, and I'm going to fill it around with Leca, and then I'm going to finish it off with a top layer of pebbles. So that's something that, again, I got this from the orchid room. She uses a top layer of pebbles or river rocks or something that's non-wicking, and that maintains more moisture in the pot, and that prevents that top dry layer, which can also be a little bit salty and dry and harsh for those new root tips. So the goal here is to make sure that those new roots that are growing, this orchid has quite a few of them up top. We want to make sure that it has a good environment at the bottom to continue to grow down and adapt into this setup. So one of the more important things here when you are potting into self-watering Leca or potting in Leca in general is, in this case, you want the medium to be packed quite tight. So I want to make sure that I'm shaking the pot a little bit. I want those spheres to touch, because if those spheres are touching, they are wicking the moisture levels all the way up to the top of the pot. If you have a lot of gaps, if you have like a big gap of roots in between, you're going to lose that contact with the Leca, and that constant contact is what brings all of that moisture all the way up to the top. So this is what's called an always moist system. Some folks don't like using this setup. It is definitely not for every orchid. In this case, I'm doing an experiment long term to see how these orchids adapt. So you guys will be seeing how the Brassivola does, and you're gonna see if this works or not in my environment. But anyhow, I've got the wick all the way to the top. I'm putting my tag in, which I also disinfected just in case, and I'm going to top it off with a layer of pebbles at the end. So that is the Brassivola Digbyana, which is the youngest seedling that I have of the group. We're going to do the same exact thing with the Brassolalia yellowbird, and this one has quite a vigorous root system. You can see some new root tips growing, so the hope here is that those roots continue to grow down into the medium and adapt. So this orchid is supposed to be 1 year from blooming. You can see those nice new green root tips right there, so I was very careful when I was removing the bark. And I was also super careful to get everything off, because if you maintain the bark, it's going to be a very moist environment and it can mold. So you want to get rid of what you can. You can't always flush the pot if you see mold and there's a little bit of, you weren't able to get everything off. But here I am, I'm just making sure that all of the spheres are being packed so that they all maintain contact. we're all done with the yellow bird. So the next step here is to top this off with a layer of pebbles. We've got some fresh new green root tips up top, and the hope is that they continue growing down and adapt to this system very quickly. So the very last orchid that I'm transitioning over is the Neophanetia falcata. And this one I'm a little nervous about because its root system is very, very vigorous. It's got a lot of roots. They are older roots. They're still healthy, but I want to make sure that they adapt in this transition. And that is part of why I add kelp to the Leca mix. I want to make sure that they get a little bit of a boost and they're able to thrive in this new environment right away. So I suspect that this is going to be quite a shock to this orchid because this orchid is used to growing in bark. It was in a pretty small pot, so it got a lot of moisture all the time, but I suspect that some of these roots might die back. I will say, now that I'm editing this video, it's been 3 weeks, almost a month, and I'm not seeing any dieback yet, which is fantastic. And I'll keep you guys updated, and I'm going to do part 2, which shows how they're adapting over time. But this one I love. The flowers are so beautiful. The flowers smell so good. It's one of my favorites, and I want it to do well. So we'll see how it goes, and I'm going to start packing the Leca in here and be very careful with these roots. We're almost done here. I'm going to top this off with some pebbles. And as I said, the top pebble layer will make sure that the moisture is maintained within the pot. And I'm doing this in a series of videos so you can follow along with the progress of these orchids. As I'm editing this, it's been about 3, almost 4 weeks since I transitioned these orchids over. So in about a week or 2, I'll post an update on how these are doing for part 2. So the goal here is so that you can see how these orchids do over time, and I'll go ahead and see if this is a viable grow method for me in New York, where we have humid summers and very dry winters, and then you can sort of get a feel for how this would go if you were to transition your orchids. I do hope this was helpful. I've recently got a bunch of new subscribers, so all of the new subscribers, thanks for watching. Everyone who's been watching me for some time in these last 2 months since I've started this channel, Danny, Deb, Teresa, Nina, thank you guys for watching. I will keep you guys updated here, and I do post quite regularly, so if you guys are on Instagram, give me a follow at Nicole Deanna Orchids, where I post more updates more regularly. Thanks again for dropping by, and I will see you guys soon. Bye!